Hello all. I'll go ahead and get started while others trickle in. My name is Kara Goldenberg, and thank you so much for joining us today to discuss RMI's new report titled Making the Clean Energy Affordable, How Totex Ratemaking Could Address Utility Capex Bias in the US. And we're so excited to see the wide interest in this webinar and are looking forward to presenting today as well as discussing the report findings with you all. In case you haven't seen the report, we'll put a link into the chat for you to access there just in case. Excellent. So I'm joined today by two of my co-authors on the report, Kaya Rabane and David Posner. The three of us are on the carbon-free electricity team at RMI, and we focus on utility business model and financing reforms to accelerate the clean energy transition. And as for an agenda today, we're going to first provide some context on some of the major challenges confronting the electricity sector, including defining utility capex bias and how different regulatory strategies can address it. We'll then go on to describe how Totex works and share findings from our research into the feasibility of implementing Totex in the US. And then we'll finish our session with Q&A from participants. You should have a Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can input your questions there as we go, and then we will address questions at the end of the presentation. Excellent. So starting us off with some context in terms of the challenges ahead for the electricity sector. So the United States is at the cusp of a massive spending surge in the electricity sector to decarbonize the power sector, as well as meet increased load from electrifying buildings, transportation, and other sectors. We need significant investment in clean energy resources. Spending in the power sector is also expected to increase due to investments necessary to ensure resilience in the face of extreme weather events, replace aging infrastructure, and modernize the grid. And if costs are not carefully managed throughout the clean energy transition, customer bills could rise dramatically, which could create particular hardship for low-income households, many of which already struggle to pay for utility services. So as shown in this chart here, the 15 million US households that live below the federal poverty level spend an average of 17% of their income on energy. And the average energy burden only drops below 5% once household income reaches twice this level. So to maintain affordability through the investment surge, it is critical that utility spending be cost effective, right? So this means utility regulators should discourage unnecessary spending and motivate utilities to select the best solutions from available alternatives. So to achieve this goal, all potential projects, whether they represent capital expenditures, otherwise known as Capex, or operating expenses, otherwise known as OPEX, from the utility's point of view, should be on equal footing so they can compete fairly against each other. However, the playing field is currently not level due to an issue known as Capex bias. So Capex bias stems from the traditional approach of cost of service regulation for investor-owned utilities, and how the utility revenue requirement is established. So as shown here, Capex is added to the utility's rate base and depreciated over time. The utility is allowed to earn a return for its shareholders on the undepreciated balance. In contrast, OPEX is quickly passed through to customers via rates. And since the return utilities earn on Capex is higher than their cost of capital, utilities can increase shareholder profits by increasing their spend on Capex. Thus, investor-owned utilities generally prefer capital projects such as long-lasting infrastructure investments rather than OpEx alternatives like power purchase agreements or energy efficiency, even if those programs or expenses are more cost-effective. I'll now turn it to my colleague David to describe the regulatory solutions being pursued to address Capex bias and how Totex fits in. David?
Thanks, Kara. So there have been a number of regulatory rate-making mechanisms that have been tried out to address the Capex bias in the cost of service model, which Kara described. I'll go through a few of them here quickly. One is OpEx capitalization. It essentially allows utility to capitalize operating expenses instead of expensing them immediately and earn a return, and then amortize that balance. Performance incentive mechanisms, which allow the utility to earn a reward or incur a penalty given performance in a specific OpEx domain. Shared saving mechanisms, which are type of PIN, which allow the utility to retain some of the savings from a cheaper alternative, like an OpEx solution to a previous Capex approach. Next slide. A modified clawback mechanism. So this essentially allows the utility, if it does not expend its full amount of approved Capex, to retain that amount for a period of time and earn a return, even though it's not putting that, hasn't established a physical asset and won't be recovering the capital from ratepayers. A calibrated efficiency carryover mechanism, which is a mechanism that over a period of years in a multi-year rate plan allows utility to retain some of the savings from both improved OpEx and Capex performance. And actually, depending on how the calibration of that sharing of the savings is done, it can address Capex bias. And then finally, Totex, which we'll be discussing in this webinar, which since removes the distinction between OpEx and Capex for rate-making purposes. Next slide. So a schematic here, which roughly tries to place these various mechanisms on a scale of narrowness of scope and broadness of scope. By broadness of scope, we mean applicability for a particular utility's revenue requirement rather than just specific assets. The other thing which distinguishes these is that the two that are most broad in scope, the calibrated ECM and the Totex Ratemaking, have not been tried out in the US. So we're going to discuss Totex Ratemaking, which we think does very effectively level the playing field between Capex and OpEx, or at least potentially does so. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaya.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to just give an overview of how Totex Ratemaking actually works now. So as David already mentioned, Totex Ratemaking treats Capex and OpEx equivalently for rate-making purposes. And by doing that, it actually addresses the root cause of Capex bias, unlike the other mechanisms that David just discussed. Now, Totex Ratemaking is part of the UK's performance-based regulation framework known as RIIO, and it has also been adopted in Italy. And I just want to, before moving on to describing how it actually works, just note that this is one component of RIIO. We're not talking about all of RIIO here. RIIO, as those of you who are familiar with it already surely know, is quite a complex framework, and it involves many different components. And we're focusing specifically on this mechanism that can make Capex and OpEx similar from the utility's perspective. So as you can see in the diagram here, basically what Totex Ratemaking does is it takes Capex and OpEx, and specifically controllable Capex and OpEx. And what that means is just the categories of Capex and OpEx that are deemed to be sufficiently under the utility's control, takes those two and it combines them to form Totex, short for total expenditures. Then Totex is reapportioned out into two pots of money known as slow money and fast money. Slow money functions just like Capex does in the traditional revenue requirement formula. It is added to your rate base, it's depreciated over time, and the utility is able to earn a return on it. Fast money works just like OPEX does in the traditional framework. It is passed through quickly to customers. Now you'll see something called the capitalization rate there under the Totex box. And what that is a predetermined rate that specifies how much of Totex goes into slow money versus fast money. And that capitalization rate is based on the regulator's best estimate of what the utility would need to efficiently spend to meet its service needs. So say the regulator expects that if operating efficiently, the utility will have about an 80% share of Capex in its total expenditures. In that case, the regulator could set the capitalization rate at 80. And then for the utility during the plan, once the Totex allowance is set, if the utility spends $1 of Capex, 80 cents of that becomes slow money and 20 cents becomes fast money. Equivalently, if the utility spends $1 of OPEX, 80 cents becomes slow money, 20 cents becomes fast money. So basically it just ends up being a way of treating those two equivalently while still building your revenue requirement in much the same way as you did traditionally. Now, one other thing to note is there is an adjustments box in this diagram, and that's just because not everything flows through the Totex construct. You've got things that are deemed uncontrollable by the utility, say taxes and fees, pensions, that kind of thing. Those are handled separately. And also any like performance incentives, those sorts of things will fall into that adjustments box. So it's really the controllable part of the revenue requirement that ends up going into Totex. Next slide. Now here, just for comparison, are the two diagrams you've already seen. So up top, you've got the traditional approach, and down at the bottom, you have Totex Ratemaking. And once again, just to stress this, you can see that in the top box, Capex is being added to rate base, while in the bottom, slow money is. And in the top, OPEX is being passed through to customers, while in the bottom, fast money is. So they are really quite similar in that way. Next slide. Now, one thing that is important to note is that Totex Ratemaking isn't the only tool that you should consider if you're interested in limiting costs and ensuring affordability through the clean energy transition. Totex Ratemaking specifically addresses Capex bias. And that's important because Capex bias is a threat to affordability for the reasons that Kara already described. But there's a closely related perverse incentive that's known as gold plating. And Totex Ratemaking does not address that one. Now, what gold plating is the incentive to just grow Capex under the traditional framework. So basically, if you're a utility and there are two infrastructure investments and one's more expensive, there is actually a financial incentive there to pick the more expensive one. I'm not saying utilities will always do that. There's many things that go into utility decisions, but that incentive is there. While Capex bias is the incentive specifically to substitute Capex for OPEX. So basically, gold plating is an issue. And Totex Ratemaking just doesn't address it. It doesn't make it worse, but it also does not make it better. And so for that reason, we would encourage regulators who are interested in exploring Totex Ratemaking or other Capex OPEX equalization mechanisms to also be thinking about ways to encourage overall cost control. Next slide. Now, under RIO, Totex Ratemaking addresses Capex bias, while there are other performance-based regulation mechanisms that incentivize cost containment. These include, most importantly, I would say, a multi-year rate plan with a revenue cap. So this basically sets the Totex allowance in advance for a number of years and adjusts it over time for various different factors. And by doing that, it actually it creates a cost containment incentive because the utility is able to keep a share of any savings relative to its Totex allowance that it manages to achieve, as well as it bears a burden of any overspends relative to that allowance. And the way that RIO does this, and specifically RIO 1 in this case, since RIO 2 evolved a bit, but this mechanism is there in both, is something known as a Totex incentive mechanism. And what this is basically a performance-based regulation mechanism that allows the utility to do what I just said, keep a share of savings and bear a share of overspends. Now, I'll just note that in the multi-year rate plans typically used in the United States, you usually have something not a Totex incentive mechanism, but something called an earnings sharing mechanism. And that can, if it's constructed in a way that preserves that cost containment incentive, that can also play this role. So the MRP is the key, and then having a mechanism that makes it in the utility's best interest to actually aggressively pursue the lowest cost solution is what's important. And then by sharing both the savings and overspends with customers, this means that customers do get a benefit from any savings during the plan, any cost containment during the plan. And then also when the next MRP comes around, then the regulator, as the theory goes anyway, will be able to see what the utility actually needed to spend, and will be able to make a more informed decision about the next revenue requirement. And that's where a lot of the real savings can come in, because then ideally the customers would capture all of the revealed savings. Next slide. And I'll pass it back over to David now.
Thanks, Kai. Next slide. So, Totex Ratemaking. All right. I accidentally double-clicked, but thanks for that reminder. So Totex Ratemaking is potentially the most comprehensive strategy to address Capex bias, but it hasn't been adopted, as I mentioned before, in any US state. It has, however, been aired for discussion in a couple of rate-making proceedings, for example, in Hawaii and New York. But when that happened, there were concerns raised that Totex Ratemaking would conflict with US accounting standards, and Totex Ratemaking was not adopted. So we wanted, as the core, or at least the original question in this research, was to investigate whether that really was a major barrier to adopting Totex Ratemaking. So the issue is that US GAAP, or generally accepted accounting principles, allow utilities to use regulatory assets and liabilities for public reporting purposes. And that's codified under FASB Accounting Standard 980, commonly, or at least known among people who deal with these issues as ASC 980. And so regulatory assets and liabilities, for a refresher, are used by US regulators to spread costs and credits or income over time, and they play an important role in keeping rates stable.
Hey, David, can you speak up just a little bit? I think some
Sure.
people have trouble hearing you.
ASC 980 doesn't, impinge upon the rights of regulators to continue to use regulatory assets and regulatory liabilities, but it is necessary for firms that are presenting GAAP results if they want to display those regulatory assets and liabilities on their public financial reporting for investors. And the concern had been that if ASC 980 was found to be in conflict with Totex Ratemaking, that they would no longer be able to make that presentation on their statements, and the resulting change in their steadiness of income and just change in general would spook investors and drive up their cost of capital. Next slide. So we wanted to investigate how concerned regulators should be about this potential accounting conflict. And so we interviewed utility accountants, staff from FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, credit analysts, equity analysts, and other experts. And we framed our interviews around two questions. Would Totex Ratemaking undermine a utility's ability to apply ASC 980? And if it did, so what would the real world consequences be? And with that, I will kick it back to Kaya, who will discuss our findings.
Thanks, David. So just a reminder that there is the Q&A is an option if you have questions, so feel free to just use that liberally as we go, and we'll loop back after the end of this section to answer them. So in terms of our findings, as David said, we had two primary research questions. And question one here is, would Totex Ratemaking undermine a utility's use of ASC 980? And once we started digging into this, we realized this really wasn't one question, it was more like 4 questions. So we've reformulated this to be 4 sub-questions. So I'll just step through them one by one. The first one, and this was really the biggest one, this is the one that we were hearing about at the beginning of the research project. So this was the main focus of concern, was would Totex ratemaking make the whole utility ineligible to apply ASC 980? Now, the reason this was a concern is that under ASC 980, regulated rates are required to be designed to recover the specific entity's costs. And the question was, well, if you're earning a return on slow money instead of Capex, would that push the entire utility out of the scope of the standard? And for various reasons, which we can discuss more in the Q&A, but are also outlined in the report, we concluded after speaking to the experts we talked to and thinking about this pretty hard, is that we expect the utility would actually still fit comfortably within the scope of ASC 980. So we do not think this is an issue. Next slide. Now, sub-question 2 is, would Totex ratemaking prevent the recognition of individual regulatory assets and liabilities? Now, this came up because ASC 980 also has some requirements that individual regulatory assets and liabilities must meet in order to be recognized on the utility's financial statements. And as was already discussed, regulatory assets and liabilities are used widely in rate making. They're used for all kinds of things, storm cost recovery, field costs, and other purposes. And so there was this concern. Now, we looked into this, and our answer to this also was, no, we don't think this is a concern. And specifically, it's because we don't think that it makes sense for regulators to include these as part of the Totex allowance. If they did, there would probably be a concern, but as long as you handle them separately in that other box labeled adjustments in the schematic that I discussed before, it shouldn't pose any problem at all. And the reason that we think that those are not appropriate to include as Totex, we go through this in more detail in the report, but in short, for the most part, regulatory assets and liabilities are things that are not really under the utility's control. So if you are, say, recovering storm costs over time, the storm happened in the past, as the utility doesn't really have an ability to make different decisions about those costs now, so Capex bias just isn't an issue. There's also an issue of duplication, because if you have a regulatory asset or liability, you're recovering something over time. If you dump something into the Totex allowance, there's also part of it that gets recovered over time. So it's kind of like you're layering 2 things on top of each other that just don't need to be layered on top of each other. So basically, the takeaway from this one is we don't think this is an issue either. Next slide. Now, the third sub-question was, would the utility be able to apply ASC 980 to the Totex itself? And this one arose because some of the folks we spoke with were concerned that analysts and investors and other members of the public would no longer be able to estimate the size of the utility's rate base by looking at its financial statements, because based on what's reported on there now, you can make not an exact, you can't get the exact number, but you can make a ballpark estimate of how big the rate base is. And if you move to Totex ratemaking, that might no longer be the case. So the question arose, well, could you create a new regulatory asset to track the difference between the Totex rate base and the what's reported on the financial statements, so that any interested parties would be able to understand how the two are connected to each other? Now, pretty quickly, this became obvious that no, just because of how this standard is defined, this is not really a feasible use of it, but it's also not necessary. The utility can actually disclose any key information it likes in a note to its financial statement. So if there was really an interest in knowing the size of the rate base, that could go into a note. And regulators also could even say, hey, we believe that you should disclose these things, and basically define what the utility should provide to investors that way. That said, a lot of investors, most likely most members of the financial community, are not going to need to know the size of the rate base. It's more a return on investment that's of interest. But if this was actually a concern, there is a way around it that does not require the actual use of ASC 980. So once again, not a concern. Next slide. And then let's see, so the fourth sub-question is, would adopting not only Totex rate making, but also a multi-year rate plan with a revenue cap and a Totex incentive mechanism make the utility ineligible to apply ASC 980? So this came up because if you pursue a broad enough set of reforms, and there are many in Rio to choose from, you might actually eventually decouple revenues and costs sufficiently that the question was, could you actually lose the ability to apply ASC 980? Now, first off, we looked at whether the MRPU and the revenue cap and the TIM would fit within the standard. And the answer there is pretty clearly yes, we think. Many utilities in the US have already used multi-year rate plans with revenue caps. So far, that has not created any issue. So that's clearly in alignment with the standard. And a Totex incentive mechanism is really a kind of what's known as a performance incentive mechanism, or PIM. And PIMs are specifically accommodated within the standard as something known as an alternative revenue program. And so we believe the TIM would also fit within the standard without any problem. Now, this bigger question is, well, if you keep piling different reforms on top of each other that put more space between the utility's own costs and its revenue stream, would it eventually fall outside the scope of standard? Here, the answer is yes, it could eventually. That could happen. But that's really not so much about Totex rate making as it is about the overall PBR framework. And this actually did come up not too long ago in Hawaii during their performance-based regulation proceeding, because the commission was not inclined to commit to having a rate case at the end of the plan, at the end of the multi-year rate plan. And then this question arose, well, would the utility still be able to apply ASC 980? And the commission decided to move forward anyway, despite not knowing that answer. And in the end, the utility actually was able to continue applying the standard. But if US regulators continue moving down the road of performance-based regulation and really tying more of a utility's revenues to its performance instead of to its spending, eventually you may cross this line. So it is possible at that point, a utility would not be able to use ASC 980, AKA would not be able to, or in other words, not be able to include its regulatory assets and liabilities in its financial statements. Next slide. Okay, so that was just research question one. And I know that, I'm guessing that those of you who are accountants on this call or are really involved with utility accounting probably would like to know more details about everything I just said. Again, you can find those in the report, and there was a link in the chat. Maybe one of my colleagues can paste that in again for anybody who joined late. But right now I'm going to move on to the second question. So this is what would happen if utilities actually did lose the ability to apply this standard? Because we don't think that this would happen just from Totex rate making, but let's say it did, what would happen? Now, if a utility had to discontinue ASC 980, basically there are two things that would just mechanically that would happen. Number one, its existing regulatory assets and liabilities would need to be written off and expensed. So that would cause a one-time jump or drop in its reported income. And number two, its reported income would fluctuate more over time, even if its underlying cash flow and profitability did not change. And when I say reported income, what I mean by that is the income being reported to investors on the financial statements. This isn't its actual, the actual money that it has on hand to do things with. This is specifically what its financial reporting looks like. Next slide. Now, if those things happened, the next question would be, would the sky fall, or would this be manageable? And based on the experts we spoke to, we concluded that the impacts would almost certainly be manageable. Now, for the utility's credit rating, one question was if it lost the use of the standard and therefore its financial accounting was impacted, would its credit rating change? And the credit analysts we spoke to said, well, no, we don't think so, because we could adjust our methodologies. We'd ignore that one-time write-off, and then we could adjust our methodologies as needed going forward, as long as the utility provides us with the data we need and it's provided in a public manner. So basically, that should not be an issue. And there has been some hand-wringing about credit rating impacts when this has come up in proceedings before. So we don't think this is actually an issue. Number two, for the utility's valuation, similar story. Equity analysts are pretty savvy, and they're able to distinguish between accounting changes and real shifts in cash flow and profitability. So you don't expect any impact to the valuation either specifically from an accounting change. Right now, that's what I'm talking about, not Totex rate making broadly writ, but specifically if a utility were to lose the use of ASC 980. Number three, would the cost of capital go up? So institutional investors are the largest investors generally in investor-owned utilities, and they are also sophisticated actors. They're likely to look to the equity analysts for help understanding if there is a change, and they can also run their own analyses in a pretty sophisticated way in many cases. So you don't actually expect them to be unduly spooked by the loss of ASC 980. Retail investors also could adapt over time. They already are comfortable with unregulated businesses and investing in them. And there might be a bit more of a transition period there, but basically we don't think that this would be an insurmountable obstacle either. And then finally, regulation. So all of what we're talking about so far has to do with the utilities public reporting. So regulators, for their part, they could continue to use regulatory assets and liabilities in rate making, regardless of whether the utility is able to apply ASC 980 or not. So that also should not be any kind of a major problem. Next slide. Now, our report focused on these accounting questions because these seem to be the major barrier to even considering Totex rate making in the United States. But we did look into a series of other questions, which I'm not going to go into right now, but we certainly could in the Q&A a bit more. First off, Totex rate making would be a major change to the utility business model. So it's going to affect more than just accounting if you actually implement it. So recognizing that, we considered whether Totex rate making would be likely to affect the utility's financial health, whether it could alter the pace of decarbonization, or whether it could make utility accounting more complex. We also looked at a series of what we're calling design questions, which are basically if a US regulator decides to move forward with an investigation of Totex rate making, there are various questions that will probably come up. So we provide initial answers or really just initial thinking to each of these. And some of these we've already touched on, but basically what share of the utility's total cost should be included in Totex? Should regulatory assets and liabilities be included in Totex? Should fuel costs be included? How can cost containment be encouraged? How should regulators set the amount of the Totex allowance? How should regulators set the Totex incentive rate if they're using a Totex incentive mechanism? How should the capitalization rate be set? And should the allowed ROE be lowered if Totex rate making is implemented? And that last one arose specifically because in the Rio framework, the allowed ROEs are a bit lower, and they are not quite as much lower as they look, but we can talk more about that later if folks want to. We also in the report explore the feasibility of clarifying or updating ASC 980 if there is a desire to do that. Next slide. So just to sum up, the really big takeaways, the biggest one is that we don't actually expect Totex rate making to cause accounting problems. We do not think that it would result in the discontinuance of ASC 980, and we were not able to find any other potential conflicts with US accounting standards. So basically this issue that folks have worried about, we don't think it's an issue. And then secondly, even if utilities did lose the ability to apply ASC 980, we don't think that the real world consequences would be that problematic. We think that they would be manageable. So for our part, we don't see any barrier to exploring Totex rate making if US regulators wish to do so. Next slide. And I'll hand it back to Kara for this portion.
Great. Thanks so much, Kaya and David. Hope you guys enjoyed that presentation. As I said in the beginning, we'll now be moving on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Looks like we have about 20 minutes or so for questions, so that should be plenty of time. However, if we don't get to all questions and you have a burning question that you leave the webinar with, please do reach out to us. Our contact information is included in the report. And I also wanted to make a note that we're joined today by our friend and colleague, Danny Kermode, who is a utility accounting expert. And Danny helped us significantly throughout the development of the report, especially navigating some of these stickier accounting questions. And so Danny might pitch in during Q&A as helpful. Okay, great. Well, I'll stop sharing my screen now. If we need it to answer any questions, I'll bring it back up. But I'm going to get us started with some of the questions that came through in the chat. Early on, Kaya, I'm gonna perhaps pass this one on to you. A participant asked, how does incentive-based principles get applied to Totex?
I'm not sure if I know if there's a specific set of incentive-based principles that you're referring to, but if you mean more intentional incentives in regulation, the main focus of Totex rate making is really to address what's an existing perverse incentive that's created by the traditional rate making formula. So it's not yeah, that I guess that would be my answer, is that basically it's undoing something that shouldn't be there anyway, and basically putting Capex and Opex onto the same footing. And feel free to follow up if I misunderstood your question completely.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kaya. There's another question here in terms of addressing the utilities' tendency to gold plate, right? So the different regulatory options to encourage cost control and customer affordability. David or Kaya, I'm curious if one of you would like to perhaps touch upon the complementary regulatory reforms that should be or could be considered alongside Totex rate making to ensure overall cost control for utilities.
David, would you like to take that one, or shall I?
I'll let you. I think it's the TIM total incentive mechanism, but I'll let you address it in more detail.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there are a number of strategies you can use to incentivize overall cost control. The ones that we that are present in the RIO framework that we highlighted are the multi-year rate plan with a revenue cap. So basically, that can incentivize cost control if you allow the utility to share in the savings or bear the burden, part of the burden of its actual spending in relation to its revenue allowance over a number of years. And if you peg that revenue allowance to something that is outside of its direct control, so rather than tying its revenues directly to its own spending decisions, you can index the revenues to external factors like inflation, customer growth, those sorts of things. And there's some relatively complicated mechanics within RIO about how the revenue requirement is escalated. And then secondarily, as David already mentioned, having some manner of sharing, allowing the utility to share in a portion of any cost savings, or making it bear a portion of any cost overruns. In RIO, they use that Totex incentive mechanism to do that, which is similar to like a shared savings mechanism that we know here in the US. You could also use an earnings sharing mechanism to do that. And actually in RIO too, they include one of those as well. And what an earnings sharing mechanism does is basically it takes a look at what the utility, what its allowed ROE is, its allowed return on equity, and then what, based on its actual performance, it would be earning. And it's, say if it's like quite a bit higher, it might, the ESM would share that overage with customers in some way, maybe like a 50-50 split. So rates are adjusted to do that. Or if the utility under earns, you could also use the ESM to kind of address that. So both of those mechanisms can work. There are certainly other types of cost control measures out there as well. I mean, competition is something that can be used. Certainly the traditional prudency review has some role to play, although if information asymmetry is high, it's hard to rely on only that. But there are certainly other mechanisms out there you could also look at.
Great, thank you, Kaya. We have an attendee who's interested in hearing sort of how, or having us provide an example of a utility investment decision that Totex would affect. So in thinking about the typical cost of service regulation incentives, what that would drive the utility perhaps to choose to invest in, and how that might change, I'd say, compared to Totex incentives. I can take I can take, yeah, no, I can actually, I can take this one on. I think non-wires alternatives is a good example to discuss here. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, non-wires alternatives are usually distributed energy resources or demand side management, those types of programs that can meet grid needs other than building or upgrading infrastructure, so making those more capital heavy investments. So non-wires alternatives typically include those OpEx expenses rather than the CapEx investments. So if I was a utility and I was weighing sort of these two options, right, under cost of service regulation, my inclination would be to go for that infrastructure upgrade or building new infrastructure to meet, you know, increased demand on a particular area of the grid, for example. However, under Totex, my incentive would be to choose whatever is most cost effective in terms of the traditional capital investment versus the non-wires alternative. And so if that non-wires alternative is more cost effective, that's the one I'd go with. And so it changes sort of the decision-making considerations that the utility has.
Actually, let me just add there, and Kaya may want to weigh in as well. What it makes the utility is agnostic to that CapEx, OpEx decision because the percentage is fixed ahead of time. Actually, it would without a total cost cap, it wouldn't incent the utility to choose the more expensive option, whether it's OpEx or CapEx, but in combination with a total cap, then it will choose the less costly because it wouldn't want to incur some of the overruns there.
Yes, thank you for that additional statement, David. Important to point that out. Okay. So Kaya, it could be helpful for a few folks to talk through again the difference between slow money and fast money and sort of the reasoning behind how those are treated in Totex.
Sorry, I just like lost my Zoom, the little maximize thing. It might be helpful to put one of those diagrams back up to just quickly run through it. I feel like it's harder to visualize it without that. But while you're getting that, I'll just start by saying that basically slow money and fast money are just they're pots of money that function like CapEx and OpEx in the traditional rate making formula. So basically, under traditional cost of service regulations, since the utility does invest in long-lived infrastructure and recoups those costs over a great many years, usually through rates, the regulator will treat capital investments differently under the revenue requirement formula. So that's where you'll get a return on your investment for shareholders. I mean, there's a little bit of a return associated with OpEx, but it's not very much. While OpEx, which is things that are usually more like recurring costs over time, operating costs, things like that. Well, operating costs, obviously, but variable costs related to whether it's generation, transmission, what have you, those get passed through quickly to customers, meaning they just get recovered quickly from customers. So basically, the distinction there is really just that if you were to have Totex rate making and you can't really call slow money CapEx and fast money OpEx because you've already used those words, right? But they basically play the same role in the formula that CapEx and OpEx do in the traditional formula. So CapEx gets added to rate base, slow money also gets added to rate base, fast money gets passed through, meaning it just gets recovered quickly from customers, and OpEx does as well. And yeah, the fundamental distinction is just that top part of the diagram in Totex rate making, which is that you basically are smushing your CapEx and OpEx together into something called Totex, and then you're using this predetermined rate to divvy them up into slow money and fast money. And the logic of that is just that by doing it that way, you are putting CapEx and OpEx on equal footing because the same percentage of either CapEx or OpEx that the utility spends will end up as slow money and as fast money. So, and I know I probably just described it exactly how I did before, so I'll just invite my colleagues if there's any other clarifications that would be helpful, feel free to put those in there.
Okay, no, thanks, Kaya. I think that was pretty clear. We have a question in terms of the UK Rio framework and how they were implementing Totex and sort of the reasoning why the ROEs there aren't as low as they seem compared to ROEs in the US. Because I know, Kaya, you made a comment about that. Could you provide just a bit more detail in terms of why they may not appear, why they're not as low as they may appear?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few different reasons, and we do go into this in the write-up more as well, so folks want to reference. One reason is that allowed ROEs in the UK are stated in real terms, and those in the United States are stated in nominal terms. So you need to include an inflation adjustment to the UK ROEs in order to put them on the same level. So basically, if your inflation rate is 3%, then if you have a 5% return in the UK, it would be numerically equivalent to an 8% return in the United States. So that takes away a lot of the difference between them. And just the reason for that, the underlying reason for that is that in the UK, rate bases are actually indexed for inflation, while in the United States, they are not. So that also means that in the US, investors are actually bearing the risk of not knowing what inflation is going to be. So actually their return should be a little bit higher than the return in the UK, where that's basically baked in. And then there is also a third thing that arises, which is in the UK, there is a distinction drawn between the allowed ROE, which is the ROE used in the revenue requirement formula itself to calculate the revenue requirement, and what UK regulators refer to as the expected ROE. And the expected ROE just includes a reasonable estimate of how much the utility could be expected to earn in performance incentive mechanisms. It's not necessarily a big difference, but those two terms do come up. And in the US, you generally don't think about those two things and compare them. So if you're looking at just the allowed ROE, but the expected ROE is actually higher, then obviously that's also a bit of the difference. I'd say those are the three main reasons.
Great, thank you so much, Kaya. I think, as expected, there's a question around the capitalization rate and how that is established. Could you provide perhaps just a bit more detail in terms of what would sort of go into that determination, and perhaps how the UK has approached that?
Are you asking me or David, or
whoever would like to take that on? I
feel
think
like I'm speaking a lot, so but I'm happy to take that one. So the question is more how it has been set under Rio, or how it should be set, or is it kind of both?
I would say, like, what are the different considerations that regulators should take a look at when deciding that capitalization rate? How could they go about that?
So the fundamental consideration is just, I mean, at a broad level, is what share of total spending, meaning controllable spending, what share of Totex would you expect to be Capex if the utility runs its operations efficiently? And so that's kind of that's what you're going for. You really want to find that number and use that as your capitalization rate. And that's just because then you'll be capitalizing the same amount, of Totex as the utility, if it's running efficiently, is actually spending. Now, that's obviously the short answer. The longer answer is that you need to estimate it. And as with just about anything like this, it can be complicated. So in the UK, it's been basically, it's been based on the utility's business plan that it submits to the regulator, and then combined with regulatory judgment. And there's a process that they have gone through to try to elicit accurate information that then feeds into the rate. The rate is set once for the total plan period. That's important. So it's not like it's being adjusted all the time to reflect actual spending. But the actual process has been, certainly it's a bit complicated in the UK. And a US regulator would not need to do exactly what the UK regulator does. They should make their own decisions and decide what aspects of Rio to adopt and which aspects they think they could do better on. And yeah, if you adjust the capitalization rate too often, you could recreate some Capex bias, because then the utility, if it there would be some incentive to increase CapEx in order to increase your capitalization rate. But if you don't adjust it frequently enough, it may be that you don't get it right at first, and you do need to make some adjustments. So I think just weighing those two things and balancing them so that you are trying to get the benefit of both without going too far in one direction or the other way would be the way to go.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kaya. Danny, I have a question that I think you could help us answer. Given that you are our utility accounting expert and come from a lot of experience in that realm, do you think that Totex rate making would make the accountant's job harder in this case?
No. I think a distinction has to be made between the rate making process of the regulator, where they determine the revenue requirement, and then the accounting that comes out of that. So in the purest sense, I would say that the accounting is going to be basically the same, other than made notes to the financial statements where they really describe the process that's being taken place when they use Totex. But the accounting itself, it doesn't change. So I think that any complexity would be on the regulator's side and setting rates itself, where the accounting side, it should have minimal impact, in my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Danny. Okay, we have a question about a particular example. In this case, if a utility purchased a massive number of demand reduction devices in advance, like heat pumps, could that not be considered a capital expense and therefore be treated as either Capex or Totex? I think maybe I can try to address this question. I think the beauty of Totex, right, and what the intention behind it is that the utility, from their point of view, is seeing that dollar spent as a dollar spent of Totex, not necessarily Capex and OpEx, right? So that dollar spent is being lumped together in that pool of Totex. So it's not necessarily needed to make that differentiation between Capex and OpEx, as it's getting, all of those investments are getting pooled together as Totex. Great. Well, it looks like we have time for maybe one more question. I'd love to hear perhaps all three of your thoughts on how Totex can relate or accelerate the pace of decarbonization, and sort of given RMI's mission, ensuring that the clean energy transition sort of is accelerated alongside maintaining affordability. How do you guys see these two very important goals sort of coinciding and supporting one another?
David, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll go first, and just very broadly. I mean, it eliminates this bias, and therefore, in my view, if adopted, allows for, in combination with other mechanisms that control costs, but allows for the best solution to be chosen, or at least removes one bias that might incentivize a utility to not choose the best solution for decarbonization. And that, I think, a system that allows for that flexibility is preferable.
Yeah, I would say that it's basically one piece of the puzzle. It's not alone enough to certainly get the level of decarbonization that we necessarily want or need, and it won't necessarily result in the most cost-efficient solution either, if not paired with other reforms. But by addressing Capex bias, like David said, that gets at a key source of inefficiency. Now, the actual impact of Totex rate making, like directly on decarbonization, might actually be either negative or positive. And the reason for that is because it depends on how the utility is structured, what it's facing, what its decarbonization options look like. Renewable energy projects do tend to be pretty capital intensive. So if you apply Totex rate making and don't do anything else, and the utility might actually, Capex bias might be driving it towards building a wind farm or something, and now maybe something else will look a little bit better. But at the same time, a lot of solutions like energy efficiency and a lot of solutions for demand flexibility require OPEX, and therefore they are right now disadvantaged because of Capex bias. And I will just say, for even that first case, which I mentioned, that where, if Capex bias is currently incentivizing the utility to pursue really big, like capital intensive wind farms, solar farms, whatever it is now with the IRA, it might not actually you probably won't get the optimal solution from that, because you have a perverse incentive in place. It's an incentive to basically spend more capital expenditure. And rather than just leaving it in place because it happens to align with decarbonization or whatever else it is that you're looking at, I'd recommend really looking at how to remove that perverse incentive across the whole utilities operations, and then specifically try to incentivize what you actually want. So if you want carbon reduction, use a mechanism to incentivize carbon reduction. So basically get rid of Capex bias and perhaps construct like a carbon, emissions reduction performance incentive mechanism or something to focus the utility on what you actually want rather than just spending more of ratepayers' money.
Danny, anything to add there?
Well, I was saying the real balance, I think, or the real power of Totex is that ability of the utility to be spending fast money, expenses, and gain a return on it. In regulation, I've seen it a couple times where the balance has been fairly difficult for the company because they were, I think cloud computing is a good example of that. Tremendous benefit to move to cloud computing from the mainframe world, but there was pushback because the mainframe gave a rate-based type of return. So Totex allows the company to say, well, we can actually spend quite a bit of operating expenses on this project because of decarbonization or costs, and still get a reasonable return for our investors. And so I think that's what has to be balanced. I think earlier there was an example or a question where they said, well, if we have a difference between a nuke and a solar farm. Well, those are two capital projects. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how about a solar farm and some operating upgrades that would cause more efficiencies to allow more power to come through. Well, Totex would say, oh, well, go ahead and do the efficiencies and don't worry about the solar. Where the current regulatory structure, the company would probably go for the solar, notwithstanding that it could be more efficient to do the O&M expenses.
Hey, Kara, there was a question that came out that I saw kind of float by earlier, and I'm not sure if we addressed it, but I'm thinking it may be a good clarification to just tack on at the end, if that's all right. So there was a question earlier about how to, like, in terms of setting the capitalization rate, that division between fast money and slow money, how to do that in a way that would actually equalize incentives. And I just wanted to quickly say that that's actually automatically, however you set the capitalization rate, you will end up with equal incentives because the same rate is applied to both Capex and OPEX. Now, if you set the capitalization rate, too high or too low, it may be that you're capitalizing either more or less of the utilities expenditures than it really needs to have capitalized. It may be making more capital investments than you're capitalizing. So there's a reason to try to get that right, but it's not because the incentive won't work otherwise. And that is actually a major benefit over the other broad-based mechanism we discussed, the calibrated efficiency carryover mechanism, because there you really do have to fine-tune the two pieces, the Capex ECM and the OPEX ECM, to try to get those incentives. The same while Totex, basically by smushing the two things together at the get-go and then just using one rate for both Capex and OPEX does equalize incentives between them.
All right, and we'll leave you with that. We're about a minute over, so thank you all for sticking with us. We know this is a complicated topic, but we obviously, you can see, we find it very important that regulators and stakeholders sort of consider the range of options available in order to maintain costs. And we appreciate you adding your questions to the chat. If there was any questions that come up afterwards, please do reach out to us. We are more than willing to chat through Totex any day. So thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your days.